Hello, this is the European History Lecture for Tuesday, the 4th of January in the year of our Lord, MMXXII. This is 2021.
What?
22. Yeah, I. That's the two. See, I knew it, but I didn't yet train my mouth to the whole 2022 thing.
You ruined your introduction.
It's not ruined. It's just got the perfect flaw that the Arabs always have to let God know that we're not trying to compete with him. So, everyone has experienced the traumas of war, and this creates an unusual diplomatic moment at the Congress of Vienna, which Metternich is able to turn into something actually functional. Metternich builds a system that turns the clock back so that the nations of Europe are all ruled by kings of one sort or another. And then, make sure you have your notes out. You can, leave the fan on. But if you're cold, you can move to another part of the room. And then, the system is designed to preserve itself through stasis and through the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe is an agreement amongst the leading nations of Europe that rather than allow another French Revolution to spin out of control and curse the continent with another Napoleon, that it is accepted that the business of all of us is to preserve Europe's situation, to prevent violent revolution. And in this, we will work together. This kind of broad agreement between nations is extremely rare. For example, back during the time of the Cold War, the science fiction writer Frank Herbert once posited a solution to the problem of nuclear war. And the solution was this. All of the nuclear powers would agree that the first nation to use nukes on the battlefield would be targeted by the rest of the nations, and their capital city would be destroyed in a series of atom and hydrogen bomb bursts, thus punishing the first use of nuclear weapons. But it never happened for a variety of reasons. First of all, there wasn't broad agreement that that was the best way to handle it. Secondly, the only answer to the massive number of Warsaw Pact troops in Eastern Europe was atomic weapons. There is no way that NATO forces could have prevented a Soviet conquest of at least the European mainland with conventional forces alone. It would have required the use of at least tactical nuclear weapons. And everyone knew that. Also, I don't know why I'm going deep into this, but I'll take another moment to conclude the thought. Understand that nuclear weapons have prevented more wars than the deaths they caused, by far. The world has not seen a period of general peace like we have had since the end of World War II, with no major wars between major nations since the time of the Roman Empire's height. And part of that is the genuine and reasonable fear that a conflict between major nations could spin out of control and end life on Earth. One of the things about Earth is that's where we keep all our stuff. We really don't want all life on Earth to be destroyed. So even the most crazed dictators have shown some restraint. At some point that may change, and the world will become a very much more dangerous place. But the Concert of Europe preserves the basic structure of Europe from 1815 to 1848, with the exception of France. And France's problems are very, very carefully modulated so that everyone knows it's not going to be another Jacobin terror or Napoleonic expansion. And the general peace that is established by the Congress of Vienna lasts all the way until the advent of World War I in 1914. So a 33-year peace in terms of keeping Europe stable, and a 99-year peace in terms of preventing another general war. That's a pretty good record. Now, one of the chief proponents of the system of the Concert of Europe was the Russian emperor who becomes Tsar in the 1820s, Tsar Nicholas I of the House of Romanov. Nicholas I is the ultimate in European conservative. European conservatives are not like American conservatives. American conservatives are actually, this shows you how screwed up our language has become. We, being a conservative myself, I will say we are actually liberty-oriented. That means we are liberals. We are classical liberals. But in the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, American progressives renamed themselves liberals, and their allies in the press renamed liberals into conservatives. Genuine conservatives are monarchists or papists. And Nicholas I was an absolute monarchist. And he was also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. I'm going to give you an impression of Nicholas's character and the way in which he pursued his duty as Tsar, but also his duty as the Gendarme of Europe. Actually, before I go on, there are a number of you learning the Franc case. What's a gendarme? It's a pretty common word. But year after year after year, several, most French students don't know it. I don't know why. That's exactly what it is. Just raise your hand next time. But no, you're absolutely right. A gendarme is a policeman. So Tsar Nicholas I, Tsar and autocrat of all the Russias, is the policeman of Europe. Now, I have said for years that the United States is the policeman of the world, in the sense that ultimately peace in Europe, Asia, and beyond is guaranteed by American military might. At some point that will be challenged, as the Russians challenged it during the Cold War, but in the end, the Cold War didn't go hot. Well, Nicholas sees himself as the enforcer of the Concert of Europe. So, give you an idea of what a real conservative sounds like, what Europeans would also call a reactionary, somebody who wants to return things to an idealized past, but also somebody who's willing to spend Russian blood and treasure in order to prevent another Napoleon. So, here, this is an address by Nicholas to the army. Here in the army there is order. All things flow logically one from the other. No one here commands without first learning to obey. No one rises above anyone else except through a clearly defined system. Everything is subordinated to a single defined goal, and everything has its precise designation. That is why I shall always hold the title of soldier in high esteem. I regard all human life as being nothing more than service, because everyone must serve. Now, this was in Nicholas's coronation address to the Russian army. This is from his Coronation Manifesto to Russia in general, not just the army. So, when Nicholas is coronated through Russian Orthodox rite, I'll say something about the Russian Orthodox Church just in case I have missed it. Christianity begins with the death of Christ and becomes an underground movement in the Greek and Roman world. But an offshoot goes south to Ethiopia, founding the first distinct Christian church, the Coptic Church. It's the oldest Christian church in the world. Within the Persian Empire, Nestorian Christians established themselves. And that's another non-Western, non-European Christian tradition. And Nestorians still exist as a persecuted minority in Iran and in Pakistan and India. In the primary Christian region, though, of the Roman Empire, Christianity becomes legal and formulates itself in the 300s AD after Constantine the Great makes Christianity legal and sets the stage for Christianity to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire falls, the Bishop of Rome becomes the most important single individual in Western Europe, because there is no unified Western Europe. The Western Empire is gone, the Western Emperor is gone, and there are a bunch of barbarian kings who the Latin Christian Church have to convert or deepen their Christian faith. So the Pope basically is the chief Christian in the Western Church. In the Eastern Empire, however, in the Byzantine Empire, the Patriarch of Constantinople is one of several patriarchs under the Byzantine Emperor. The Byzantine Emperor is considered to be God's chief agent in the world. And under him is the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is the leader of the Christian church in Constantinople. Then there's the Patriarch of Antioch, of Jerusalem, and of Alexandria in Egypt. And all of these patriarchs rule different regions of the Eastern or Byzantine Empire under the emperor. So the church and state are unified. The tensions between the Greek and Latin churches cause a great schism in the 700s and 800s AD, where the Greeks no longer acknowledge the Western Church as being truly Christian, and where the Bishop of Rome, who we call the Pope, says that the Eastern Church has gone off into heresy, and the Western Church therefore no longer recognizes the Eastern. So, for 1,000 years, the Greek Orthodox Church develops on its own. It is during this time that Russian missionaries go to Rome and Constantinople in order to look at which type of Christianity they're going to adapt. They're not impressed by Rome. They're very impressed by the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, and by Eastern Orthodox Rite in general. So the Russians become Eastern Orthodox Christians. When Constantinople falls to the Turks in 1453, the Eastern Orthodox Church no longer has the Patriarchate of Constantinople. It had lost Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria in the 700s to the Muslims, 600s and 700s. In Moscow, the priests there make a very interesting decision. They see the first Rome, the first leading city of Christendom, lost when the Western Empire was lost and with the Great Schism. They see the second Rome, Constantinople, as lost when the Turks take it over in 1453. Who will become the third Rome? And what the priests say is that there will be a new patriarch in Moscow, and that Moscow will be the third Rome. So Russian Orthodox Christians to this day look at the Patriarchate of Moscow as the third Rome. They see the Russian Orthodox Church as the lineal descendant of the real Christian faith that comes out of Israel to Rome, to Constantinople, and then to Russia. There are also other Slavic variants, for example, the Serbian Orthodox Church. And there is still a Greek Orthodox Church. All of them, though, share Eastern Rite Christianity. In Eastern Rite Christianity, under the Romanovs in the Russian Empire, this man and all the czars were God's chief agents. Just as the Byzantine Emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor, was considered to be God's chief agent. So whereas in the West, the Pope has an independent power, in the East, the patriarchs never did. Patriarchs ruled in conjunction with the imperial power. And in Russia, this is also true. So Nicholas is not only taking office as the Tsar and autocrat of all the Russias, but Nicholas I is also taking office as God's chief human within Russian Orthodox understanding. Okay? So this is what he chooses to say as part of his announcement to the people of Russia and to the nation during his coronation. Not by daring and rash dreams, which are always destructive, but gradually and from above, laws will be issued, defects will be remedied, and abuses will be corrected. In this manner, all modest hopes for improvement, all hopes for strengthening the rule of law, and for the expansion of true enlightenment, and the development of industry will be greatly fulfilled gradually. The legitimate path, open for all, will always be taken by us, that's the royal we, that's him, with satisfaction, for we do not have and cannot have any other desire than to see our motherland, Rodina, attain the very heights of happiness and glory preordained for her by Providence. So what Nicholas is saying to his people and to the world is something that all post-French Revolution monarchs have to say. They can't just imagine that the French Revolution never happened, that Louis XVI never got his head chopped off. That would be insane. All monarchs during the Concert of Europe period are terrified that another revolution will happen. So all monarchs in their own separate ways are going to deal with the problems that led to the French Revolution. For example, in constitutional monarchy Britain, evolutionary change is adapted to reform society away from the excesses that make life for the poor so horrible. But in Russia, what Nicholas is saying, and remember, this is a man who can make things happen. Nicholas says that all change will happen gradually, in an evolutionary fashion, not in a revolutionary fashion, and that all change will happen from above. He is reserving unto himself the power to reform, the power to clean up corruption, and he will do it. He's a tough guy, and he's a reactionary, but he's an honest man who really wants the best for Russia. So he is an active agent in trying to make things more efficient. For example, one of the things Nicholas does is he reforms Russia's legal code so that it's much more in harmony with the Napoleonic Code, which is something most people outside of Russia would never have imagined. No, it's not completely Napoleonic Code. It still places the Tsar and the Church in special roles. But what Nicholas wants is he wants an efficient autocracy. And he wants an autocracy that can use the power of the state to improve the lives of the nation, the people. So, he makes it clear that all change will happen from above. Okay. Here is an observer talking about Nicholas decades later. This is in Revolutionary year 1848. For a long time, only two real forces have existed in Europe, revolution and reaction. Actually, he says revolution and Russian. No transaction, no treaties are possible between them. The existence of one is the death of the other. So, what this observer says is that Russia, under Nicholas I, is the antithesis of the revolution. And that so long as Russia under Nicholas I exists, no revolution anywhere within range of Russia's forces will be allowed to happen. Now, 1848, as you will learn, is a tumultuous year where para-revolutions pop up in dozens of cities throughout Europe. It is the greatest challenge to the Concert of Europe since its establishment 33 years before. One observer says, the people need potatoes, but not a constitution in the least. That is wanted by the educated urban classes who are incapable of doing anything. So this is a supporter of Nicholas I who says, you want reform, but you're one of the chattering classes. The people want potatoes. You want a constitution. They count. Not so much you. Here's another. Our main defense against a mass revolution lies in the fact that among us there are neither the elements nor the instruments for it. This is in Russia. There are no elements for revolution because freedom of the press, popular representation, national guards, and things of that nature are complete nonsense to 9/10 of the Russian population. And in Russia, there is no freedom of the press. There is no freedom of speech. There is no freedom of association. And when he speaks of national guards, he's talking about armed citizens, like the militias that fought the British at Lexington and Concord. like the militias that became Napoleon's army. None of this exists in Russia. So revolution should be very unlikely in Russia. Now, as an old man, Nicholas is looking back on his life. Nicholas lives to the 1853 Crimean War. And as an old man looking back on 30 years or so of rule, this is what he says. How strange is my fate. They tell me that I am one of the mightiest princes on earth, and one must admit that anything, that is, anything which is permissible, ought to be possible for me, and that, in fact, I could be anywhere and do anything that I wished. But for myself in particular, however, just the reverse is true. And should I be asked the reason for this anomaly, there is but one possible reply. Duty! Yes, that is not a meaningless word for one who from childhood was taught to understand it as I was. This word duty has for me a sacred meaning, before which every personal impulse must give way. All must yield to duty until one vanishes into the grave. Duty is my watchword. So Nicholas did not look upon the imperium, his autocracy, and his religious role within the Russian Orthodox Church as an opportunity for license. He didn't look at it as an excuse to go partying. He saw it as a grave responsibility. He saw it as his duty. But this duty was not merely restrained to Russia. I'm going to flash forward to 1848 to tell you why Nicholas is so important. In the revolutionary year of 1848, 33 years after the Congress of Vienna establishes the Concert of Europe, revolutionary ideas are back. We're now more than a generation, maybe 2 generations removed from the Napoleonic Wars. And it's during this time that people are saying, maybe our old men are just stodgy. Maybe revolution is the way to go. And so, again, in France and in Germany and even in parts of Poland and Western Russia, and particularly in the Austrian Empire, cities erupt in street violence. Mobs and crowds take over the streets. In Germany, a diet, a congress is established in the medieval capital city of Frankfurt to try to unify Germany as a constitutional monarchy. And in the midst of all of this, among other things, including the appearance for the first time publicly of the Communist Party, the Hungarians rip themselves away from Austria. The Hungarians want an independent kingdom. And they are sick of being ruled by the sausage-slurping Krauts in Vienna. So they actually drive out the Austrian army. And the Austrians have no ability to drive back in. Hungary will be independent, and it will have done so through violent revolution. Several Russian armies cross the frontier and conquer the Hungarian resistance. They crush it. With typical Russian brutality, they crush it. Anyone that the Russians get a hold of who doesn't immediately recant, surrender, and even if they do recant and surrender, they're still going to be punished, is going to be killed in so public a fashion that it will be a lesson to everyone: do not engage in violent revolution. And the moment the Hungarian rebels are destroyed, Nicholas's armies march out as Austria's armies march in. Nicholas has saved Hungary, not for Russia, but for Austria. And he did so proudly, as an expression of solidarity with the Concert of Europe. That's the Gendarme of Europe, the policeman of Europe, who will send the troops in to prevent more violent revolution. Questions about Nicholas before we move on? Okay. The period after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and especially after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, up until at the very least the First World War, and arguably the beginning of the Second World War. So we're talking 1805 to 1940. How many years is that, oh math people?
1805.
1805 to 1940. 1805 is when the Battle of Trafalgar was fought between the British Navy and the French and Spanish navies. 1805 to 1940 is 135 years, right? Okay. For 135 years, the British Royal Navy has controlled the seas. Now, the British Royal Navy actually had a good deal of control over the seas for 150 years before that. But from 1805 until really the first year of World War I, maybe the second, the British ruled the waves. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves, goes the song. And Britain's naval power, since the battle with the Spanish Armada, has been its watchword, its defense. Britain is protected by the wooden walls of the Royal Navy. This Pax Britannica is going to characterize the 19th century. And it's going to make the 19th century, it is as important as the Concert of Europe in making the 19th century relatively peaceful in terms of big general war. Because the Royal Navy at its height is more powerful than its next 2 or 3 competitors. In other words, Britain can effectively control and end piracy on the high seas in a way that, since World War II, we have not done. Frankly, one of the things I'm ashamed of, along with the fact that the last person on the moon was an American in 1972, December of, is that the American Navy permits piracy to exist off the Horn of Africa and in the islands of Indonesia. The American Navy should sweep these pirates from the sea. And merchant ships should be armed until that happens. Yes?
I don't really think that's the fault of the Navy, both my parents. But I think that's more the fault of the politicians.
You damn right it is. No, you're right. I'm not ashamed of the Navy. I'm saying the Navy is the tool by which we could end global piracy on the high seas.
Yeah,
but
there's been many examples of what happens when people mess with the Navy off the Somali coast. This actually happened. I'm not kidding when I say this. A boat of Somali pirates approached an American guided missile cruiser thinking it was a container ship. And
how you could mistake those profiles is beyond me.
Turned into red mist.
Yeah. Yeah. Did they use their Sea Whiz on them, or did they use a 5-inch gun?
No, they used Sea Whiz.
Yeah. Oh, the Sea Whiz will do it.
I've actually fired a Sea Whiz. It's loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sea Whiz is basically a Gatling gun with 20-millimeter cannon ammo. And it's designed to shred missiles that are on kamikaze runs to American warships.
Yeah.
The Russians have their version of it too. But if you employ that against a boat, unless the boat is an armored battleship from times past, it goes bye-bye.
It's got. I mean, I can't really say much about it.
Yeah.
But because I don't know if that's possible. But it's like you press the trigger for half a second, as soon as the ground's got on.
Yeah.
It's firing depleted uranium shells that's meant for a missile at a human.
Yeah, it's going to be a bad day if you're on the receiving end of that. I guess the point I'm making is that the British government was willing to use the Royal Navy to turn the world's oceans into a place for civilian commerce, and they did so. In my judgment, we should do the same thing. But evil conservative talking here. What Britain's Royal Navy, though, is able to do is not preserve a world just for the British Empire. Oh, the British Empire is strong, and it grows during this time. But also allowing other powers, even the bloody French, to expand their empires. Because what Britain wants is free trade. Britain does not want to conquer the entire world. Britain wants to rule its empire, defend its empire, and prevent slavery. And we're going to get to that in a moment. And the Royal Navy is going to be a great force for peace in this regard by making sure that piracy on the high seas has a very high price and is very risky. And making sure also that any other power who threatened the high seas, whether it was a nation or an empire, was quickly shown that no one messes with the Royal Navy. So the Pax Britannica, the British peace, is something which exists beyond Europe, which allows the United States to devote all of its military spending in the 19th century pretty much to its army. Because we don't need a navy that's bigger than a very limited size, because the Royal Navy will actually police the seaways. Now, as an American, I want the biggest navy possible. Understand, I'm a naval enthusiast. But the British make it possible for countries to develop peacefully, and they encourage free trade. So this is a huge benefit to everyday people, to civilian life everywhere. And the warlords of the world have to take the Royal Navy into account wherever and whatever mischief they are up to. Okay. In the early 1800s, Britain, like every other society that's been at war for a long time, goes into a period of what can only be described as moral decadence. It happened to us. After World War I, our troops come home, and the U.S. government, in all of its wisdom, progressives' wisdom, decided that alcohol would be against the law. Yep. In 1919, the U.S. Constitution was altered twice. First, to allow the women's to vote. Secondly, to outlaw the sale and consumption of alcohol. So you have combat veterans coming back from France who can't go down to their neighborhood bar and get a beer. Is this going to work?
Yeah.
Is this going to make us a society without alcohol? No, what it does is it gives us organized crime. Before Prohibition, which is the banning of the sale of alcohol, there was no large-scale organized crime organization within the United States. There were a bunch of local ethnic gangs that preyed upon their own immigrant communities. But with Prohibition, any American who wants to have scotch or rye or vodka or a beer or wine, unless they make it themselves in small quantities and never sell them, has to go to the mafia. And so the mafia becomes a going concern and a big deal, and it's been plaguing our society ever since. In the 1920s, you have flappers and speakeasies and jazz music. Flappers are women who are immodest, who walk around showing not just their ankles, but their calves, who go in public and dance in jazz clubs, with many of whom have black musicians playing their demon jazz from hell. And these are speakeasies, which is a phrase for illegal alcohol clubs run by organized crime. And everyone, I will call on you, everyone who is anyone stylish engages in this. So there's loose culture after World War I because the soldiers want to come home and blow off some steam, and because society has had its moral fibers stretched by the exigencies of war. Yes?
Didn't we make a deal with the mafia during World War II to like defend our ports?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Yeah, but we then stuck it to one of their leaders, and we deported Lucky Luciano to Sicily.
Yeah.
And he thought, hey, I made a deal with the government. Yeah, you're also a murdering criminal scum. Yeah. But yes, we did. Look, in World War II, it was the right thing to do. And in World War II, the mafia played ball, even with Luciano gone. Okay, after Vietnam. Vietnam is a 10-year-long war run by the politicians and not the generals, and it turns out to be a bleeping disaster. It is the only war the United States has clearly lost, well, up until Afghanistan.
Wait, what happened in Afghanistan?
Don't get me started. You're not nice. Anyway, right after Vietnam is basically 65 to 75. Right after Vietnam, what do we get? Disco.
Yeah.
We get disco. We get drugs.
Yeah.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And throughout the mid and late 70s into the early 80s, basically society's moral fiber has been stretched by the stresses of the war in Vietnam. And so, oh, you're a monogamous married person. How old-fashioned of you. No. You're supposed to have free love with anyone and anything you can have. It's just, I lived through it. I remember it. It was different. And it was in the aftermath of a war, a stressful war. Now, this didn't happen after World War II, and it didn't really happen after Korea, but those were both somewhat successful. Vietnam was not, and World War I was a real strain. In any event, in Britain, you have the Napoleonic Wars. Did you say everything you needed?
Yeah.
You want? Okay. You have a moral cesspit in terms of society. People are drunk in the streets. They're brawling. They're fighting. Families are breaking up. Children are going orphaned. Why? Because daddy wants to drink, or because mommy's an alcoholic, or society is falling apart. But at the same time, there is a fire and brimstone preacher marching around Britain named John Wesley. John Wesley brings moral revival to Britain. In the late 18-teens and early 1820s, this moral revival hits. But the most important person in it isn't Wesley, it's a man named Lord William Wilberforce. Lord William Wilberforce comes before the British people and says, we think we're a great country, but we're not worthy of that. We think that we should lead, but we're not worthy of that. We think that we're good and decent Christians, but we're not. Because the British Empire employs slave labor in Jamaica, around the Caribbean, in India, and it permits the global slave trade. So long as we allow human beings to buy and sell other human beings, we are not decent Christian folk, worthy of power or trust. We should not sleep comfortably in our beds while our government aids and abets slavers and slavery. We need to outlaw slavery, and we need to use the Royal Navy to end the world slave trade. And at first, people laugh. Oh, who's this little me, end the slave trade? He knows nothing about economics. He knows nothing about what will happen on Jamaica. Okay, fine, we freed the slaves. What are we going to do to all the blacks that are there? Send them back to Africa? Where? What are we going to do? Keep them there? But they're not going to be slaves anymore. What are they going to be? People laughed. They ridiculed. They said that Wilberforce was an idealistic dreamer. But by the mid-1820s, Britain was changing. It was like waking up after a horrible hangover because you've partied for 3 days straight. Britain looked itself in the mirror and didn't like what it saw. So Parliament takes up Wilberforce's anti-slavery legislation and makes it law. So in the mid-1820s, Britain becomes the first modern society to officially ban slavery everywhere within British Isles and the British Empire. Now that's something, okay, that is going to change the Caribbean. It's going to change Jamaica. It's going to change Barbados. It's going to change a number of British colonies fundamentally because they had been slave-oriented. But that's not all. Britain's Royal Navy sets up a West African anti-slavery patrol off, I'm going to reach over you, excuse me, please, off of the Guinea coast of West Africa. And they're going to do that in order to throttle and destroy maritime slave trade. And it works. Americans can no longer get slaves for their plantations. As of the 1820s, the American South, the colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the other slave societies all the way to Texas, have to be content with having native-born slaves, because new slaves from Africa is no longer an option because Britain's Royal Navy puts a stop to it. Now that's a commitment. It's not merely that Britain outlaws slavery within its own ranks, it spends money on its fleet to keep the slave trade down. That is a genuine moral commitment to the betterment of not just Britons, but of all mankind. And it's one of the reasons that even though it makes my Irish ancestors spin in their graves, I contend that the British Empire, on a whole, even though it has some crimes in its history, is by and large one of the greatest forces for good in human history. And one of the reasons I believe that is because Britain ends the global slave trade, except in one place. In the mid-1800s, it becomes clear that there is an African slave trade still at work that Britain can't stop yet. Here is East Africa. There is Arabia. Arabs have, since before the time of Muhammad, liked having black slaves. So black slaves are bought in East African slave markets, brought across the Red Sea, and sold in Arabia. They still are. I'm going to say that again. They still are. Go talk to somebody who's from the Saudi kingdom. Talk to anyone who knows anything about Arabia. Look up information online. Old-fashioned black slavery is alive and well in Saudi Arabia. Max Wilderson's brother was roommates with a Saudi in college, and he told this story from his brother. His brother said, "How can you still have slaves? I mean, come on, black slaves? What's wrong with you?" And the Saudi roommate says, "They're not slaves. We call them servants. And we provide food, shelter, medical care, everything they need." So Max's older brother says, "Hey, sounds like a good deal. I don't have to worry about anything. Maybe I should become a servant." "Oh, no. You would never want to become one of these servants. Never." They're slaves. Slavery still exists. There are two forms of slavery in the modern world that are alive and well, again, to our disgrace. One of them is the black slave trade to Arabia. The other is the sex slave trade, which exists everywhere. Everywhere. One of the most horrifying things in the world is learning how many people disappear every year. They just vanish. And a lot of them are young, and a lot of them are female. And many of them are not dead. Many of them have been taken into a life worse than death, to hell in the sex slave trade. So, what the British do about this is they conquer Egypt. Part of that is about the Suez Canal. We'll talk about that. But they march up the Nile into the Sudan, and ultimately they march into the East African region, which controls Kenya and Lake Victoria and this area here. And their goal is to have an unbroken line of territory from Egypt's north coast to Kenya's east coast, in order to prevent the transport of black slaves across that territory from Africa to Arabia. The British not only devote their navy to it, but they expand their empire into a region that they don't have much interest in. Their interest is in controlling the Suez Canal. They can do that by controlling Egypt and by controlling the other end of the Red Sea at Aden, which they do. But they take over vast territories, and they spend a lot of blood and a lot of treasure doing it because they want to end that slave trade too. The British put money where their mouth is. Now, in the United States, our bloodiest war is over slavery and secession. And we, in the Union, win that war and end slavery. 100 years later, there's a civil rights movement that has to fully implement the end of slavery culturally as well as legally. But the British, 40 years before, had ended the slave trade at sea and ended it within their empire. And 40 years later, they had that unbroken line of territory to cut off Africa from Arabia and that slave trade. So, there is a moral revival. John Wesley is a part of it, but Lord William Wilberforce and his anti-slavery crusade epitomizes a change in Britain that's going to lead to the Victorian period, where Britain's really self-consciously try to be the best moral people they can possibly be. Anyway, that's what I've got for today. Tomorrow we will begin work on the Industrial Revolution. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay, you can talk quietly amongst yourselves until dismissal.